You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
If you're a lineman in charge of keeping the lights on, Grainger understands that you go to great lengths and sometimes heights to ensure the power is always flowing, which is why you can count on Grainger for professional-grade products and next-day delivery, so you have everything you need to get the job done. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 503 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, thanks for tuning into the podcast. With the last show, we started our coverage of the Atlanta campaign by giving some background and beginning to set the stage for the start of the campaign. We focused on what was going on with the Federals as the calendar turned over from 1863 to 1864. And now with this show, we'll turn our attention to the Confederates and what was happening on their side of the lines.
On that frigid New Year's Day on January 1st, 1864, just as Abraham Lincoln was hosting a reception at the White House in Washington, D.C., about 100 miles away in Richmond, Jefferson Davis was also hosting a reception at the three-story house that served as the Confederate president's executive mansion.
Everyone at the reception in Richmond was acting happy and hopeful as they welcomed in the new year, but really they had little reason to be either pleased or optimistic about their cause's prospects.
A year ago, as they gathered in the same place for the same occasion, visions of victory were dancing in their heads. Just a few weeks before that, Robert E. Lee had slaughtered the Yankees at Fredericksburg, and word had just arrived from Braxton Bragg that he had defeated the enemy at Murfreesboro. Well, that turned out to be false, but it was believed at the time.
Their hopes had grown still higher with Robert E. Lee's astounding victory at Chancellorsville in May, and when he had taken his army north into Pennsylvania a month later.
But then came the twin disasters of Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July. Although briefly, in September, Chickamauga had brought a resurgence of hope, but those hopes were cruelly dashed in November by the debacle at Missionary Ridge.
On December 31st, the Richmond Examiner newspaper summed up 1863 by saying, quote, "Today closes the gloomiest year of our struggle." And the first words diarist Mary Chesnut of South Carolina wrote in her entry for January 1st, 1864, were, "God help my country."
Along with the lost battles and lost territory were the lost men. By the start of 1864, at least 150,000 Confederate soldiers had died. Tens of thousands more had been incapacitated by wounds or illness, or were languishing in northern POW camps. Those losses came from a white population of only 5 million and from an army that had never exceeded 400,000 troops in actual service.
In addition, desertion had become a real problem and was only growing greater. Not a few of the deserters were conscripts, but many were volunteers who had served faithfully but had become demoralized by defeats, or physically worn down, or made desperate by letters from wives saying, "The children are crying for food. Can't you come home?"
Altogether, at the beginning of 1864, 60,000 Confederate troops were absent from their units without permission. That was enough to make a good-sized army.
Like the Confederate military, the Confederate home front was showing increasing signs of strain. Rare was the white Southern woman who didn't have a husband, a son, a brother, or all three in the Army. Almost as rare was the woman who didn't have a family member or sweetheart who hadn't been killed, wounded, crippled, or captured.
From one corner of the Confederacy to another, few were spared hardship and suffering. Numerous ships were still getting through the Union blockade, but the government in Richmond was doing its best to ensure they carried only military supplies. As a result, Southern civilians were only able to get a few of the many things imported before the war, such as woolens, silks, buttons, medicine, and, missed most of all, coffee.
Federal gains had cut off beef from Texas, pork and wheat from Tennessee, and sugar from Louisiana. Hundreds upon hundreds of plantations and farms had been destroyed, and thousands upon thousands of people had been left homeless and destitute.
Much of the South's rail system had been seized or wrecked by the Federals, and what remained was so dilapidated that trains had to crawl along the tracks, but still suffered frequent breakdowns and derailments. Nevertheless, refugees from enemy-occupied areas had swarmed into the lower South, where many of them were living wretchedly in shacks, tents, and even caves.
The only things available in abundance were tobacco and paper money. By the start of 1864, the Confederate government had printed $1.2 billion of the latter, which it couldn't back with gold or silver, and could only promise to redeem when the independence of their southern slaveholding republic had been secured.
In January 1863, a gold dollar had equaled 3 Confederate dollars. A year later, at the beginning of 1864, it took 20 Confederate dollars to equal 1 gold dollar. Inflation and soaring prices were the inevitable result. 2 examples will suffice. Before the war, residents of Richmond had paid 12.5 cents for a pound of bacon. By 1864, they were paying $8. In 1861, they paid about $7 for a barrel of flour. By the end of 1863, they were paying $200. In his diary, one government official wrote, "How the poor live is inconceivable."
But while the growing hardship and misery had sapped the will to fight from some, the vast majority of white Southerners were still willing to go on sacrificing, suffering, and struggling for the cause, because to them the idea of being conquered by the hated Yankees was unbearable.
In a letter published in the Atlanta Intelligencer newspaper on January 1st, 1864, a rebel soldier wrote, quote, "A few short months and the whole South will be enveloped with a black cloud of war, whose darkness will eclipse the gloom which has hitherto covered our country. 500,000 armed men, filled with a desire to achieve our subjugation, will be hurled upon the gallant men who are now struggling for independence. Should we not be prepared to meet this gathering storm, God help us in our country. Slavery, degradation, beggary, and lost honor will be our lot."
What that soldier meant by subjugation, degradation, and beggary is summed up by another Confederate, Lieutenant William Nugent of Mississippi, who wrote to his wife shortly after the fall of Vicksburg, telling her, quote, "What good will it do us if we submit? Our land will be a howling waste wherever it has been invaded, and we shall be forced to abandon it to the freed Negroes and the wild beast. I am willing to continue to fight to the last."
As the calendar rolled over from 1863 to 64, the vast majority of white Southerners may have had the will to continue the fight despite hardship and suffering, but in reality, at that point, the Confederacy's best chance for survival lay outside of itself, that is, in the psychological and political vulnerability of the North.
If between January and November 1864 the Confederate armies could inflict intolerably heavy casualties on the Yankees and not suffer too many themselves, and if they could successfully defend the South's essential production areas and communication lines by driving back or stalemating the invader.
In other words, if they could hold out long enough and well enough, then there would be a very good chance that the majority of Northerners would decide that going on with the war wasn't worth the financial and human cost, and so would replace Lincoln and the Republicans with a Democratic president and Congress committed to stopping the fighting and instituting peace negotiations.
That outcome would surely have resulted in Confederate independence, and Southerners were keenly aware of that possibility. In fact, as they entered 1864, it gave them their greatest hope.
A Confederate soldier serving in Mississippi wrote a letter to his wife on January 9th, telling her, quote, "We may be able to hold out 12 months longer, but I don't think the Yankees can with the pressure on them. The presidential campaign is already beginning to tell on them."
Similarly, the editor of a Georgia newspaper, the Augusta Constitutionalist, declared on January 22nd, quote, "Every bullet we can send against the Yankees is the best ballot that can be deposited against Lincoln's election. The battlefields of 1864 will hold the keys of this momentous decision. If the tyrant in Washington can be defeated, and when his party sinks, no other war party will rise in the United States."
I'm Ashley Graham, and as a parent, I know the back-to-school transition can be a lot. When it comes to wellness, Ollie supports me and my family through it all. Kids Multi is big in my house. It supports their immune system, and they love to take it. A win-win for everyone. Shop these products at Ollie.com or retailers nationwide. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Discover Ralph's Club New York, the new fragrance by Ralph Lauren. With blackcurrant, vanilla, and sandalwood, this scent embodies the sensuality and confidence of Usher. Like the city that never sleeps, this masculine fragrance lasts for 12 hours. Ralph's Club New York. Ralph Lauren. Shop now at Macy's.com.
As the calendar rolled over from 1863 to 64, no one was more determined to outlast the Yankees and secure the independence of the Confederates' Southern slaveholding republic than Jefferson Davis. And to prepare for the showdown in 1864, Davis took several important steps, such as attempting to tackle the rampant inflation that was devastating the Confederate economy. And he was asking the Confederate Congress to enact measures that would hopefully increase military mobilization.
But the most important step Jefferson Davis took to prepare for 1864 was to appoint a new commander for the Confederates' hard luck Army of Tennessee. As y'all know by now from listening to the podcast, the Army of Tennessee, not to be confused with the Federals' Army of the Tennessee, but the Confederates' Army of Tennessee was the rebels' main army in the Western Theater.
And its chronic lack of success in the Western Theater was the main reason the Confederates were in such a pickle, strategically speaking, at the start of 1864. Its defeats at Fort Donelson and Shiloh in early 1862 opened up the interior of the Confederate heartland to Federal invasion. The failure of its counteroffensive into Kentucky in the fall of 1862 and its attempt to smash the Union Army of the Cumberland at Murfreesboro at the Battle of Stones River at the close of the year had enabled the Yankees to secure their hold on most of Tennessee.
Its passiveness as it sat in Middle Tennessee through the first half of 1863 had contributed greatly to the loss of Vicksburg out in Mississippi. And then its barren, bloody victory at Chickamauga and the humiliating debacle at Missionary Ridge had left the enemy poised on the northwestern boundary of Georgia.
After fleeing into northern Georgia following the disaster at Missionary Ridge, the Army of Tennessee didn't stop until it reached Dalton. There, the dispirited rebel soldiers huddled around their campfires that harsh, cold winter, while Jefferson Davis, in far-off Richmond, decided what to do.
It wasn't that the Army of Tennessee didn't fight hard, since, in fact, it had some of the toughest, hardest fighting troops in the Confederacy, but the problem was that it had never had outstanding leadership at the top.
As a Virginian who had served with both armies observed, the Army of Tennessee, quote, differs from the Army of Northern Virginia in that one has General Lee and the other hasn't.
Its first commander, Albert Sidney Johnston, had been noble and brave, but unlucky. As y'all will recall, he'd been mortally wounded and bled to death at Shiloh.
P.G.T. Beauregard had taken over and done well, saving the army from destruction after Shiloh by making a clever retreat from Corinth, Mississippi. However, he didn't get along well with Jefferson Davis, and when Beauregard, for health reasons, took an unauthorized leave, well, Davis gladly seized the opportunity to remove him and replace him with Braxton Bragg.
A friend of Davis's, Bragg proved good at making plans, but bad at executing them. In addition, he had the knack of rubbing many of his subordinates the wrong way, and we've spent a fair amount of time on the podcast talking about the toxic command environment in the Army of Tennessee.
As a result of that toxic command environment, after both Murfreesboro and Chickamauga, many of Bragg's generals had pleaded for his removal. Well, Jefferson Davis had listened to them, but had kept Bragg in place. Now, though, obviously the beaten Army of Tennessee, licking its wounds at Dalton, had to have a new commander.
That's because Bragg had resigned early in December, and Lieutenant General William Hardee, the Army's next senior-most officer, assumed command temporarily, but Hardee made it clear he didn't want the position on a permanent basis.
Hardee's refusal surprised and dismayed Jefferson Davis. It also annoyed the Confederate president because it meant he'd have to select a commander from among the only other 3 generals who were qualified by rank and experience to hold so crucial a post, namely Robert E. Lee, P.G.T. Beauregard, or Joseph E. Johnston.
Obviously, Robert E. Lee would be ideal, but just as obviously, no one could take Lee's place at the head of the Army of Northern Virginia.
And as for Beauregard, if Davis appointed him, it'd be the same as admitting he'd made a mistake in removing Beauregard in 1862, and Jefferson Davis refused to make such an admission, especially since he didn't think it was a mistake.
And so that left Joe Johnston.
If Jefferson Davis wasn't going to reappoint Beauregard to the post, then logic dictated he'd have to give the Army of Tennessee to Joe Johnston. But it took Davis 2 weeks to come to terms with that decision, since it was a bitter pill for the Confederate president to swallow.
Jefferson Davis despised Johnston, and Joe Johnston loathed Davis. Their bad blood went back to the early days of the war, when Johnston blamed Davis for bumping him down several spots on the list of the Confederacy's first full generals.
Davis considered Johnston vain and selfish, while Johnston thought Davis was unrealistic in his military expectations. Based on his previous experiences with Davis, Johnston was reluctant to commit himself to a specific course of action or communicate his intentions to Richmond, while for his part, Davis resented what he considered Johnston's excessive secretiveness and insufficient regard for the office of president.
Jefferson Davis blamed Joe Johnston for the loss of Vicksburg, contending that Johnston had made no serious effort to relieve its besieged garrison, while Johnston thought that Davis himself was responsible for that disaster and accused the Confederate president of trying to make him a scapegoat.
As rebel fortunes waned, Johnston privately doubted that the Confederacy could win the war, while Davis permitted no such doubts to enter his mind, and he had nothing but contempt for those who harbored such doubts. Finally, both the president and the general were proud, touchy men who each assumed that every fair-minded person would see any given situation the way he did, and would therefore agree with him about any issue. For this reason, neither of them was willing to devote much time or energy to explaining matters, since if someone didn't agree with him, then by definition, they weren't fair-minded.
As Rich said, appointing Joe Johnston to command the Army of Tennessee was a bitter pill for Jefferson Davis to swallow, and there's little doubt that if he could have avoided doing it, he would have. The bad blood between the two men foreshadowed future troubles.
But nevertheless, on December 16, 1863, Davis wired Johnston, telling him to turn over command of the Army of Mississippi, which Johnston had led since spring, to the Bishop General Leonidas Polk, and Johnston was to proceed to Georgia, to Dalton, where he would take command of the Army of Tennessee.
When Jefferson Davis instructed Joe Johnston to go to Dalton and take command of the Army of Tennessee, the Confederate president's communication painted a rather rosy picture of that force's status, saying the army was in good shape and its morale was high. As a result, Davis said he hoped Johnston would, quote, soon be able to commence active operations against the enemy.
Davis's beliefs and expectations stemmed from a December 11th report from Hardee, who had telegraphed Richmond, saying that, quote, the army is in good spirits and we are ready to fight. But when Joe Johnston arrived in Georgia on December 27th and assumed command of the Army of Tennessee the next day, he found little resemblance between the force encamped at Dalton and the army described by Jefferson Davis.
Johnston found the army had fewer than 40,000 men present for duty, of which only about 2/3 were quote-unquote effectives and capable of fighting in a battle.
Many of the men were without overcoats or even shoes. In one division, 2 entire brigades were barefoot. Thousands of troops spent every day clustered around campfires, simply trying to keep warm. The men were chronically hungry, since rations were scanty and poor. In fact, scurvy was common.
There weren't enough horses to pull the artillery pieces or enough mules to haul the wagons, and the cavalry units that weren't up in Tennessee with Longstreet were short of horses and woefully under strength.
On average, 30 men a day were deserting, and overall, throughout the army, morale was low. It didn't take an experienced officer like Joe Johnston long to realize that attempting a winter offensive with the Army of Tennessee in its present state was out of the question. All he could do was try to set Jefferson Davis straight about the Army and its needs. And so, writing to Davis on January 2nd, Johnston said plainly that the Army of Tennessee lacked the strength and the means to carry the fight to the enemy. Therefore, he said, quote, I can see no other mode of taking the offensive here than to beat the enemy when he advances, and then move forward.
Jefferson Davis was perplexed by Johnston's assessment of the Army's capabilities and troubled, to say the least, by his proposed strategy. After all, the communications the president had received from both Bragg and Hardee had declared that the Army of Tennessee was good to go and ready to take the fight to the Yankees.
But now, here was Johnston painting a completely different picture of that army and saying he'd have to adopt a defensive strategy. Only after he defeated the advancing enemy, Johnston said, would he be able to contemplate making any offensive move of his own.
In an attempt to find out the truth about the state of the Army, Davis directed Secretary of War James Seddon to obtain a detailed report from Johnston about its condition, which Johnston provided to Seddon, but it merely repeated in essence what he'd already said.
Jefferson Davis still wasn't convinced, but he knew from past experience that trying to change Johnston's mind with arguments would only lead to another quarrel between them, and that a direct order to launch an immediate offensive would only cause the general to submit his resignation. So Davis instead decided not to reply to Johnston at all.
Joe Johnston spent January 1864 inspecting the Army of Tennessee, seeing and being seen by the rank-and-file soldiers, establishing a working relationship with its generals, and taking steps to improve the Army's condition.
He quickly realized his new command's greatest need was more and better rations. Most of the Army's food, along with all other supplies, came up the Western and Atlantic Railroad, a single-track line that ran north for about 95 miles from Atlanta to Dalton. The railroad, which was owned and operated by the state of Georgia, hadn't been carrying enough provisions to even meet the Army's daily requirements, much less let it accumulate a reserve.
On January 12th, Johnston telegraphed Georgia Governor Joseph Brown and the War Department in Richmond, warning them that unless the operation of the Western and Atlantic improved, he'd have to retreat. Well, Jefferson Davis knew this was no idle threat, so he instructed Seddon to act quickly, and within a week, additional locomotives and rolling stock had been assigned to the railroad.
By January 25th, Johnston could report that the delivery of provisions and supplies from Atlanta had improved to such a degree that not only were the Army's daily requirements being met, but that a reserve of rations could start to be stockpiled.
Johnston also moved to restore the Army's badly neglected discipline. He issued detailed instructions for drills, dress parade, calling rolls, conducting inspections, and even digging latrines. Really, although most of its troops had served more than 2 years, the Army of Tennessee under Johnston was being given what amounted to basic training.
Improved rations and tighter discipline did much to raise the Army's spirits, but by far the greatest morale booster was a system of furloughs designed by Hardee and implemented by Johnston. For the first time in the war, sizable numbers of the Army of Tennessee's soldiers were able to visit family and friends back home. Well, that is, if they had a home they could go to. All of the Kentuckians and Missourians, and many of the Tennesseans and Arkansans, came from regions then currently under federal control, as did some of the Alabamians and Mississippians.
But wherever they went, the vast majority of the furloughed troops returned in due course to their units with revived spirits. And so, as January 1864 drew to a close, the Army of Tennessee was on the mend as improved diet, tighter discipline, and some time away from their units all worked wonders to boost morale.
In a January 23rd report to Richmond, Johnston reported on the troops' improved health and better morale, but also warned that the Army was still far from ready to undertake offensive operations against the Federals holding Chattanooga. In fact, Johnston set a proposal to Davis, declaring that since the Federals around Chattanooga were too strong to be attacked, when the Army of Tennessee was ready to undertake offensive operations, it should be moved out to northern Mississippi, from where, After being reinforced by Leonidas Polk's forces, it could strike up into western Tennessee.
Johnston said that should the Federals at Chattanooga try to take advantage of the Army of Tennessee's shift out to Mississippi by advancing toward Atlanta, then a force of 3,000 Confederate cavalry could delay them and harass their lines of communication and supply until the Yankees were obliged to retreat.
Jefferson Davis's response to that proposal was the same as it had been to Johnston's previous plan, that is, passive-aggressive silence. On one hand, the Confederate president continued to doubt Johnston's reports that the Army of Tennessee wasn't ready to undertake offensive operations, but Davis also refused to order the general to make an immediate move forward against Chattanooga. And on the other hand, Davis would neither concede that such an advance was impractical nor agree to the new plan Johnston had just presented as an alternative. And so, as January 1864 drew to a close, Jefferson Davis and Joe Johnston were locked in a disagreement over strategy, and it didn't take a fortune teller to see that the inevitable consequence of that disagreement would be that the Army of Tennessee's de facto strategy would be one of just reacting as best it could to the enemy's moves.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Jefferson Davis and His Generals, The Failure of Confederate Command in the West by Stephen E. Woodworth.
This is a re-recommendation of this title, which is a great look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of how Jefferson Davis exercised his authority as Commander-in-Chief and how it influenced the course of the war in the Western theater.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on how to join the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and support the podcast in that way, just like Kathleen L., Mark D., David C., and M. Jenick did this past week.
A big thank you to them, and also to Spiritwood Music for their kind permission to use their song Midnight on the Water as the music you hear at the start and at the end of every episode.
And then, thanks to each of you for listening to this episode. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.